I'm Charles Hudson, managing partner at Precursor Ventures. I've been here since the very beginning as I founded the firm. Prior to that, I spent 5 years at a firm called Uncork, which used to be called Softtech, which is a larger seed stage investment firm based in San Francisco. And prior to that, I've been an investor at the CIA's venture capital group, InQtel, an entrepreneur and founder myself of 2 companies, and an employee and exec at both public companies and startups.
Awesome. And so my background is entrepreneur. I've never kind of formally been an investor, but I kind of started my career off by founding a jewelry manufacturing company that I ran for about 2.5, 3 years, ramen profitably, and just kind of proceeded to make, I think, every mistake that an entrepreneur can make. So like if you take the laundry list of things not to do, I kind of checked every box. And you know, at the end of kind of 3 years, I just fell flat on my face. I actually went $30,000 into debt, closing the company and paying all the closing costs and trying to pay back investors where I could. And, you know, I actually went into a really deep, pretty awful depression for a few years and just I'd really tied my self-worth to the company. And then I ended up founding a company called Happy Pay, which is an insured random number generator company that's profitable. We do, you know, kind of high 7 figures of revenue a year, own it outright and kind of bootstrap that. But then didn't really find that I was as passionate about it and really wanted to build a company that had social purpose, but also was economically big. And it was actually I think it was 2015, my grandmother had terminal brain cancer. And I'd spent 6 months living in this hospital, kind of watching, you know, this whole process come down. And I couldn't help but notice that a lot of the software was pretty old. I was watching biomedical engineers come into her room and kind of see them try to maintain or, you know, fix a patient monitor, and they just kind of had to figure it out and write it down on paper. And that was kind of my first clue that there was something interesting going on. And then it was 2016, December 2016, I met somebody who had started a nonprofit in the medical supply space, and he took in, the nonprofit took in donated surplus medical supplies, and they take them to third world countries and developing countries. And I asked him like, oh, how big is it? You know, thinking it's this small nonprofit, and it was taking in like $10 million a month worth of donations. And, you know, the number one rule of business is go where the money is. And that was sort of a huge red flag for me that there is, number one, a very large business. It kind of passed the sanity check of, yeah, healthcare is massive. But 2, that there is something wrong for that amount of surplus to just be kind of going down the drains effectively. And so that really catalyzed about a year of research. It was December 2016 through, it was about October 2017. And I was just like calling hospitals and just figuring out what the difference between an MRI and a CT was. And, you know, kind of, I had this working hypothesis where I looked into what the nonprofits were doing with the surplus, and some of them were illegally selling it. They actually weren't supposed to be. And then other ones, they would give it to groups like Doctors Without Borders, but the problem is this stuff either wasn't usable, hadn't been repaired, and you just had rooms full of just broken medical equipment in these developing countries, and this stuff wasn't getting recycled or properly valued. And then up at the hospitals, you just have these hospitals who have super small operating margins. Like the average operating margin for a hospital is like 1.7%, which is crazy. And there's just hundreds of thousands of dollars that these hospitals literally like were throwing away. So I talked to a hospital in New York who threw a $30,000 portable x-ray machine into the garbage compactor because they just didn't know what to do with it. And so that's where developed kind of the hypothesis for Medinas. And that's when I met Charles when we were raising kind of our first round of financing. So Charles, I'm super curious about, you know, when we first approached you with this crazy idea, you know, I come from a jewelry and like API and t-shirt company background. What was sort of your thoughts about us and the company?
Well, I remember when Lindsay told me about you. Lindsay said, you got to meet my friend Chloe. I know her from my Teespring days. She's great. And she explained what you were doing, and I literally had no idea what she was talking about. She said, it's B2B medical equipment. I said, that's a lot of words. But one of my general viewpoints is if someone that I know well tells me that there's another smart person I should meet, I try to take the meeting. And one of the things I always look for is the value prop for the company really simple? And is it very easy to explain what it does? The how they do it, you can get to that later. but the what is it? And I just remember when you told me like, yeah, there's all this surplus medical equipment and people throw it away. I'm like, well, what do you mean throw it away? You're like, no, they like literally throw it away like in the trash. And I was like, well, that doesn't sound like a very good business decision by them.
Yep.
If they're throwing it away, there must be some resale market for it. And one of our closest family friends is the CEO of a hospital group. And I asked her about this problem, and she's like, yeah, it's just kind of not worth it for us to even try to find a home for most of this stuff because the matching, like the odds of finding a buyer on the other side at the time they want to get rid of it is so low. She's like, believe it or not, we do throw the stuff out. She's like, sometimes if I know the CEO of another hospital, we have a semi-expensive piece of equipment, I'll pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, do you happen to have a need for X, Y, and Z thing? And the thing that struck me as I talked to more people was most people, I can't even conceive of the world not being one where we waste all of this stuff.
Yep.
And my general view with healthcare companies is there's sort of only two kinds of founders I like to back, ones that are like deep experts and ones that have very little exposure to it. The deep experts kind of know how to navigate the system, and the people who are new to the space, they don't know better. So they're not constrained by all of the status quo when it comes time to design the solution or figure out like the best way to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And I just felt like this is one of those problems that seemed so obvious that if somebody who already was in healthcare was going to solve it, it would have already been solved by now.
Yep. That was definitely, I think, what struck us. And that's kind of how I've always thought about business is like, I try to think about, okay, Charles, I have a black box and it costs $1 to turn the crank, and every turn of the crank prints a 20. And that's like my job as an executive is to be able to, number one, tell that story so clearly, and to demonstrate its economic viability. And your job is to understand, okay, what's the risk of having people turn the crank, and can you afford to have enough boxes that will print 20s that can pay for the rent and keep the lights on, and that's kind of that symbiosis that, I think as a founder, I always try to find the clearest, simplest path forward and the simplest way to solve the problem. But also I try really hard to understand the investor perspective as well, even, not just from a financial perspective, but like a risk perspective too. And that's kind of, I think, a challenge that a lot of people think of is that there's so much to think about when you're starting a company that it's also hard to remember that there's this investment perspective. And a lot of it's just risk management and, kind of developing that hypothesis. Charles, I'm curious. So a lot of investors usually focus on kind of late seed or Series A because you have a lot of data. You're typically like the first check-in. Why did you decide to be like a pre-seed fund? That's just, it's betting on people.
I like betting on people. If I think about, excuse me, if I think about the evolution of my old fund, Uncork, it was amazing what my partner Jeff and Andy and Steph have built as a franchise. When I joined Jeff, it was me and Jeff in a little office in Palo Alto. We had $15 million under management. And I always ask myself, like, when was I happiest at every job I've had? I don't know if I was happiest at the tail end of that $15 million fund, but we raised one after that. That was $55 million. And that fund has some great companies in it. Postmates, Shippo, DocSend, Fungal, some really great names in there. And what I realized is there's this optimal sweet spot in terms of venture fund size where you have the flexibility to bet on people before they have evidence. And if you're wrong a little bit, it doesn't tank your fund. The problem is the bigger your venture fund gets, you're writing bigger checks. And generally speaking, you start trying to balance not losing money with making money, which I think is like people always asking, what's the difference between being an angel investor and an institutional investor? I said, when I was an angel investor, I mostly wanted to not lose my money because it was mine. I'd worked for it. I didn't need to generate some competitive return because I wasn't competing for dollars from other people. As an institutional investor, which is what I've been for the last 10 years, you have to think about making money more than you do, I'd argue, not losing money.
Yeah.
Which means you end up focusing on upside. And so what I learned very quickly is in a world where everybody else wants to analyze data, past performance, traction, get into the numbers, a lot of smart people are doing that work. There were far fewer people who said, I'm going to find a team of 3 people from Teespring who are going to move into the world of digital healthcare basically pre-product and think that's a good idea. And my view is if you're mostly a people person, pre-seed is a great place to invest because you get to meet people when the biggest asset in the company is the people themselves and the quality of their idea. And so what I always tell my investors is we'll meet 3,000 companies a year and we'll pick 25 or 30. And when the volume is high enough, the really special ones stand out from the crowd. And so I like this style of investing. It's really fun. You get to know people from the very beginning. You get years to hopefully build healthy, productive, supportive relationships with them. And more than anything, you get to see them grow as leaders and executives and founders and teams. And they become like unrecognizably professional usually by the time they
Yeah.
graduate to Series A and move on from us. You're like, wow, that company, like, I remember it was just three people around a kitchen table, and now they've got a team and staff and all the sort of things I associate with successful companies. So for me, it's taken me a long time in my investing career to figure this out, but this is totally the right stage for me.
Very cool. Yeah, I think for us, it's been interesting, like speaking of just kind of growth, when we first met you, it was literally just the three of us in a tiny little co-working space in Berkeley. And today I think we're 25 people. I think it's 11 or 12 full-time, and then the rest are kind of contractors. We've got a presence in Ohio, a presence in Florida, and a presence in California. We've signed one of the largest hospital systems to a 3-year agreement. We're, hopefully closing our next round of financing here, and we're about to get even bigger. And it was interesting for us, kind of like even our journey to finding product market fit. We were discussing before, this call started, that what we're doing today is kind of the same thing we were doing. Fundamentally, we were helping hospitals sell their used medical equipment. And actually how we started was as a brokerage. The value prop was basically, we branded ourselves as a marketplace for pre-owned medical equipment. But we basically figured out that the way to get started was just make $1. That's how I kind of operate every business. I figure out the fastest way to make money. It doesn't matter the complexity. Is like, how do I put, I can sell you a mint and you'll give me 2 cents for the mint. I could sell 10,000 mints, but okay, with the medical equipment, how it operated was as a brokerage. And literally we just had a team who would call into a hospital and we'd be like, all right, do you have equipment for sale? And half the time they'd say yes. So we'd figure out what it was and then we'd go find the buyer. And it was a very kind of manual process. And then, the risks of that business model ended up being that, number one, healthcare itself is innately a super relationship-driven industry. And while I could go hire 100 brokers and each broker could bring in $500,000 in GMV, eventually, we were competing with all the other brokers who were doing the same thing. They were all trying to get that same piece of equipment. And eventually, if I wanted to introduce software to create this efficiency, inevitably I'd have to get rid of these brokers, because if we did a tech-enabled brokerage model, fundamentally you don't own the accounts. You're not really embedded in the systems at the hospital. So if we don't offer a high enough amount of money for that piece of equipment and then someone else does, we just lose the business. And the other thing is, from a financial perspective, we were taking on all of the capital risk because we had to buy, sell. And, as an investor, if I'm going to go out and say, hey, Charles, I need $10 million, you're going to say, well, you're going to carry a huge, liability here, like a balance sheet that's like very risky. And who knows if an investor's going to, get on board for that. So one of the things that we did was we recognized that there was a greater sort of data and supply chain challenge in healthcare. And, as quote unquote technologists, I realized that we could, instead of doing this tech-enabled brokerage model, figure out a way to give these hospitals not only the software to facilitate the matching, because that problem fundamentally was I don't have the time or reason to care, but to give them the data to make that decision and know what's worth selling and what's worth not selling. And so we've actually sort of turned into this capital planning and insights tool and data that powers the marketplace and enables these hospitals to sell their used equipment. And it's interesting because we sort of view the buying and selling of used equipment as a way for us to get in with these hospitals and establish like immediate value. So our whole pitch is, hey, use our software for free. We want an exclusive agreement. Therefore, we're not competing with the other brokers for the equipment. It by default comes out through our system. And then that's how we make money. And then from there, we're building out all of these data insights to basically help that CEO or CFO say, hey, this C-arm has, 30% utilization and I have 2 of them in one location. I should get one up to 60% utilization and redeploy this C-arm to another hospital in my facility. And what that does is that defers a capital purchase another hospital would have to make. So that saves them 150 grand, right off the bat on their like yearly capital budget. And oh, you have 6 C-arms, that's excessive, and you have 1 OR and they're all at 10% utilization, which would never happen. But we could sell that other C-arm and recapture that value for them and also help them manage their trade-ins and all of these processes. And so it was interesting to kind of watch how we started off as this pure brokerage, but we had money flowing through our system and we were transacting and realized that we could use software to embed ourselves into the systems of these hospitals. And now when we're talking to our investors, we explain, hey, there's this much, much, much larger opportunity to help on healthcare supply chain, but we can get there by helping hospitals monetize their used equipment. This gives us a, cash flow positive business. And if it takes us 10 years to achieve this grand enterprise vision, that's okay. We're getting there profitably as opposed to burning hundreds of millions of investor dollars. And that sort of epiphany process kind of happened over the last 2.5 years from, I think, the day that I met you, Charles, to kind of now where, I'm sitting here talking about capital equipment planning and working with hospital CFOs when, I was working on t-shirt technology 3.5 years ago. Who would have thought? Yeah.
It's so funny because even in our first meeting, you said we want to build the Kelly Blue Book for medical used equipment. And I was like, what do you mean? Chloe was like, no one actually knows what this stuff is worth.
We're doing.
And I was like, yeah. You're doing it. Which I think is like really, really cool. I'm just curious, how long did it take you to learn to speak the language of healthcare? Because I mean, you came at it from such a different industry background, and healthcare tends to be one of those industries that has a lot of jargon and a lot of, specialty language.
I'm still learning. I feel like I can kind of pass as a native right now, just enough. I sort of speak with an accent, so to speak. I'm starting to get all of my, I think it was about a year in, I was able to kind of honestly know what the difference between an MRI and a CT was. I literally had no idea. Then I kind of had to learn how they worked. Because fun fact, almost all of the value of a used CT scanner is in the tube. And what a tube is, it's this tube that rotates. And a tube has a certain number of rotation seconds, and that's like all of the value. It's an $80,000 to replace the tube versus the husk of the CT scanner is only like 10 or 20 grand, fun fact. But yeah, I mean, healthcare is also strange because there's just so many acronyms. Everybody likes 3 letters for stuff. And we just had to kind of figure out what a GPO was. What is a GPO? How do you work with a GPO? Why does a GPO matter? A GPO is a group purchasing org. Many hospitals do all of their purchasing through a group purchasing org, and you have to not only get approved by the GPO, but you also have to become a contracted vendor, which means you now have a hunting license to sell to hospitals. You can't just go sell to them, except you can. So that's kind of the fun part of healthcare. And I think it's, to your point, I think it's so important to speak the language of your customer. One thing we learned is that subscription fees are not really something that you should say in healthcare. You should say a license fee. And so I've had to kind of train the nomenclature in the company of, hey, this is not a subscription fee, this is a license fee. And one of the things is that in our software, we used to say your sales, here's how much your sales are. And one of our advisors, who's a VP of supply chain with 20 years of experience, he said, in your quarterly business review to the CFO, you should phrase this as funds made available as opposed to sales. Because for a hospital, sales is patient revenue. It's not literally the selling of your used infusion pumps. And I think, all of that is just understanding how to operate in your industry and, kind of codifying that and creating it as like a cultural standard was really important. And, I think when we first started out, we were just cold calling hospitals. And we're like, do you have surplus equipment? And what I didn't realize is by calling it surplus, I was kind of fundamentally undermining the supply chain leader because it made it seem like he wasn't doing his job. But if I said, hey, do you have any used equipment you don't want? Then it was a totally different conversation. But surplus was, sort of a 4-letter word, which was sort of a fascinating thing for us, and also a lot of painful rejection on the phone. Yeah. Let me think here.
And I'm just curious, how have you approached hiring? I mean, you came from outside of the industry. You've got some people on the team with previous healthcare experience, some people without it. How have you approached just the hiring process?
I think, yeah, hiring is the most important thing. And I think it's the scariest thing and it's the hardest thing to do. And the way that I've kind of looked at it is that, number one, I needed to be very aware of who I was and who I wasn't. And that was partially how I picked my co-founders, but also I kind of sat down and said, what is our biggest weakness, or what are our biggest weaknesses? And I hired for that knowledge or found advisors who had that knowledge. And the challenge that you have is when you're an early stage startup, you only have so much money, you have equity, and you have your sales vision. And the challenge I had is I didn't have the $200,000 salary for the really high profile sales guy. And so I found the closest person I could, who could help me get into a hospital and who came from the industry. And so that's kind of what I did. But one of the things I had to be really aware of was there was a timer on this relationship with this person, because as the company grew, the needs of the company would outgrow this person. And I think it's really tough because when you have an early employee, you really have this deep, intimate relationship because you're working together day in and day out. And it's only the same kind of 3, 5, 6 people. But you have to have that really aggressive discipline to understand, hey, the needs of the company have outgrown this person. They're no longer the right person. And so there are some roles in our company where I understand that this person is either going to grow with the company or they are not, or there is a natural topping out point for them and we have to move on. And so there's a few roles in our company where kind of every 16 months, we just outgrow the person, and it's really painful. And that really comes back to, one of the things we've done at a company is we've been really, really deliberate in making sure that an employee's experience joining the company is just as good as their experience when they leave the company. One of the things that we do that I don't know how unique it is, but I think it's pretty unique for an early stage company is when we do part ways with somebody, we actually pay for them to have an hour of career transition coaching with an executive coach. We always do our best to give them severance where possible. Even people we're not happy with, we'll still give them something. For instance, if you terminate somebody on the 31st of the month, they technically don't have healthcare the next day. Never do that to somebody. Always pay for that extra month. It's just, you never regret taking the high road and being kind, no matter your industry. So that's definitely something that, and your investors will tell you hire fast and fire fast. And it's so true. It is so true. And it's really painful and it's really scary because especially, for us, we had one person who came from the industry and the rest of us were outsiders. And so we really depended on this person for knowledge, but we eventually outgrew him and we had to take that dive off the cliff and have confidence in our own ability to kind of go beyond him and bring in that next round of people. And I think it is always interesting to kind of see Silicon Valley culture in business and working with someone from a different industry or even just a different area of the world. The Midwest operates very differently than the coastal cities. And, I think more and more with technology and kind of what's even happened with the pandemic, it's leveled the playing field quite a bit for people to work together. And actually, Charles, I'm curious on your perspective. Have you seen any patterns in investing, now that everybody is remote? Because typically investors want to only invest in people in San Francisco or, Silicon Valley. Like, what have you seen?
Yeah, we're sort of half Valley, half not Valley over the history of the firm. I think the difference now is that two things. I think one of the challenges for building companies outside of tech hubs is not the founders, it's building out the team.
Yeah.
And it's, can you find startup friendly, startup aware people who can work in the way that you need to work at an early stage startup and who have enough experience to know what it feels like when you're on the right track. And I feel like what the pandemic and sort of quarantine has done is it's put everyone sort of on the same footing where everyone's remote.
Yeah.
And so we've always invested outside of the Bay Area, but I've certainly seen an uptick from my peers and their interest in and willingness to invest in companies outside of the Bay Area, to a degree that they weren't. And even if companies go back to working in offices as things get safer, I don't think investors will go back to having the same point of view about where companies are based in order for them to say yes to an investment.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a positive. I don't think everybody wants to live in the Bay Area or New York, and you shouldn't have to start a company.
Yeah. We were already sort of a 50% remote company to start, just because for us, we really recognized that at least the used medical equipment industry was pretty small from a people perspective. And so in order to find the right person, we couldn't be biased towards the Bay. We had to hire the right person kind of no matter where they were. And I think it's just made it a lot easier for us now to kind of justify that and have that sort of remote culture. Which, it's scary, but I also think it's really exciting because all of a sudden that 10x engineer doesn't have to be in San Francisco. You can find him in Canada for all you know. It just kind of depends on where you're going. Do you have any kind of like fun, weird stories that stand out from like one of your portfolio companies? I know like for us recently, one of our crazy stories was that we were affected by the California wildfires. Literally, we had a warehouse that was a tinderbox full of PPE. And I ended up having to rent a box truck with my co-founder and just like same day drive up there, load that box truck. It was like a 20-foot box truck. And I got my workout for like the month on that day and drive it back out of the line of the fire. And then learned what a cargo policy was in insurance. So, yeah, education and a workout in the same day. And who would have thought that like part of my medical equipment journey was outrunning a wildfire?
We've certainly had companies that have had really crazy situations happen. Of the ones I can think of, we definitely have a company that's had the misfortune of having all of their manufacturing being done in a small town in Italy in the middle of the pandemic. And it caused some definite launch-related delays.
Wow.
Given that they needed to wait for Italy to come back online in order to finish manufacturing the product that they wanted to sell. So that one was one of those only in COVID. Wow, like that wasn't
You
part
don't
of
really
our.
put that into your risk analysis, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'd say we've also had a couple of companies that were on the verge of, this is the sad ones, that were on the verge of like breaking through with a model that was really levered to the physical world. And some of those companies have found really creative ways to stay alive. And some of them, unfortunately, haven't. But I think it takes, being an entrepreneur, even under normal circumstances, is a really, really difficult job.
Yeah.
And trying to manage through wildfires and a pandemic is no easy task.
Didn't the Airbnb guys sell boxed cereal for like a year to stay alive, and now they've got a however many billion-dollar company that they just filed to go public with? You can sell cereal if that keeps the doors open and the lights on. That's
we have one company that pivoted into a COVID impacted business and basically made so much money in the first half of the year that they don't need to think about raising money again for a very long time. And it was totally at the CEO's direction. She was just on it. And it was one of those things where you go to the board meeting, they say, oh, we did this thing this quarter. We probably should have told you about it sooner. And here's the results. And you're like, wait a minute. That's like more money than you've even raised. You just generate that in profit in 2 quarters. And the CEO was like, yeah. So keep it up.
That happens. I know we vaguely pivoted sort of temporarily. I think anything under the umbrella of healthcare supplies and equipment is not exactly a pivot, but we were kind of uniquely poised to do the PPE stuff. And so we had a little bit of a similar story where we just had kind of crazy sales. We didn't mark up the PPE really just because at the time it was already marked up. But I can kind of relate where, for our business, our revenue is directly correlated to our ability to go into a hospital and pick up the used equipment. And for about 3 or 4 months, we couldn't get into hospitals to pick up equipment. But at the same time, we had the relationships with the hospitals. So they asked us, hey, can you help with PPE? And because we had that direct line and we were able to kind of shorten that supply chain and be like, yeah, actually, we can help you. So that was sort of our forced creativity at the time. And, we're finally kind of getting back to core business now that we're able to get into the hospitals again. I think we're kind of coming to the end of time here. I think, thinking about kind of the types of startups here, any closing thoughts major trends you're seeing as far as, investing in digital health? I think that there's a new sort of focus on that space. I have a few thoughts, but I'd be curious to hear yours.
I think there's a bunch of things as someone who, about 5 or 10% of our portfolios in digital health. And there's all these things like statewide licensing and the resistance to telehealth that I think have soured investors on digital health. I think if you asked a lot of people who don't invest in health, they would say digital health the healthcare industry does a bunch of irrational things that get in the way of technology making a difference.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of those things have been relaxed because of the pandemic. And I think it's going to be hard to go back 100% to the way that they were.
Yeah.
So I'm actually pretty bullish that things in digital health that have felt like a good idea for a really long time, but due to regulatory reasons or for whatever, or political reasons that were aggressively blocked or prohibited, those things are on the table now. And some of them are working so well, like telehealth. I don't see how you take away telehealth appointments now that we've seen how effective they can be.
I agree.
Digital pharmacies, there's just a ton of things. So I would say, if you're a healthcare entrepreneur, this is a great time to be coming to market with a new product.
Yeah. I think, for us, the perspective I have is sort of the same. There's kind of a new normal and everyone's still figuring out what that is. And the way that I'm looking at it is that I'm seeing sort of this generational changeover in sort of healthcare leadership. These CEOs and CFOs who sort of manage this whole Affordable Care Act transition that's really been the hallmark of the last 10 years in healthcare. They're reaching that point where they're stepping down, and the younger, kind of more tech native millennials are stepping up into these executive positions. And so not only do we have sort of the pandemic catalyzing change, there's a generational change that I'm seeing that I think is really going to be the beginning of a culture change in healthcare to more tech savviness across the board. And I think, kind of in closing, the advice I'd give to someone who's thinking about starting a digital health company is figure out a really clear, simple way to make money quickly. And if you can figure out a very simple way to create value and transact in a healthcare context, there's so much more opportunity beyond that. And it's really easy to get distracted because there's a ton of opportunity. But if you can really dial down into one clear thing that you can commercialize and move very quickly and decisively on, there is no shortage of abundance after that. So, all right. Well, Charles, thank you for joining me on this.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, likewise.